Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special session on Gender Reimagined and Pacific Perspectives Retold. Now, I apologize that the session is starting a little bit late, but I'm sure those of you who are at the opening ceremony this morning agree that maybe it was worth that extra time to hear from our speakers this morning. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay particular thanks to our elder Paul for this welcome to country this morning. I'm not going to give a long formal introduction, but maybe just to explain why we're here and what we'll be discussing this morning and the format of our session this morning. So this panel really came together because we know that there are several prominent narratives about gender in the Pacific. And usually these narratives are ones of disadvantage. We know that the participation of women in politics is low. We know that gender-based violence is high. And we know these narratives well through many research projects. But sometimes we also gloss over the diversity of gender norms, practices, cultures and traditions that we have in the Pacific, and also the diversity of practices that we have, particularly from Pacific Islanders, about how to engage with gender norms in a positive way for change on different levels, dealing with representation, dealing with conflict and violence, and also dealing with natural resource management, and also how we teach. How do we teach gender in the Pacific as well? So we're very fortunate today to have researchers who are not just doing research, but are at the cutting edge of practices, teaching around gender norms in the Pacific. So briefly to introduce each of them, we have Faye Siota, who's the Deputy Director of Inshore Fisheries in Solomon Islands, and has also grown up and come from a matrilineal culture, and we'll talk about these issues in relation to natural resource management today. We have Dr. Anita Togolo, who's done some excellent research and practice, particularly around bougainville and matrilineal practices, and she'll talk more about that today. I was going to say storing more, a drop into pidgin, but I'll try not to do that this morning. And we have soon-to-be Dr. Anouk, who is one of our leading historians and has done some particularly innovative work on looking back at our history and perspectives about gender and inclusion there. And then finally, we have my co-convener this morning and one of the key organizers of this conference, Dr. Masta, who has done groundbreaking work on masculinity in the Pacific and reframing how we think about gender norms and masculinity in the Pacific. So each of our speakers this morning are going to talk for approximately 10 minutes. Some of them have presentations, some of them are just going to sort of talk story or discuss. So I'll allow them to outline a little bit about how they reimagine gender and some of their work. And then we will maybe have one or two questions from myself and Mercy, and then throw open to the floor for a talk story discussion. And please forgive us if we go a little bit into lunchtime, given the fact that we've started a bit late, but I will have to at some point, I guess with the support of our organizers for the conference, wrap up this discussion, and then we can go to lunch and maybe discuss more over lunch. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Faye Siota to come and present on her case study research this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Anouk. And good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Ministry of Fisheries and the management of Solomon Islands, I would like to warmly welcome you all to my presentation today. I am honored to present this on behalf of our team that did this research work back in the Solomon Islands. So you will see there, that is the topic. And it is a case study in Solomon Islands in one of our provinces, Isabel Province, navigating matrilineal fishing and societal change, community-based resource management in Isabel Province, Solomon Islands. A brief introduction, as Dr. Anouk has mentioned, My name is Faith Yota, and I'm working as the Deputy Director for the Inshore Fisheries Division within the Ministry of Fisheries. Before I went to work within the ministry, I've started work with Wellfish. So having more than 14 years of research around community-based resource management. Community-based resource management, or CBRM for short, is our approach in the Solomon Islands to support our many communities, coastal communities, in driving towards sustainable management of their coastal resources. So with this research, you will see there, it is focused on the developing the understanding of how cultural practices, in this case in communities, for example, the case study for Isabel Province, the traditional practice of matrilineal system. I understand that most of our Pacific Islanders, through history and currently we are born and we come out of a certain traditional system. And for the Solomon Islands, we have some communities who have both patrilineal and matrilineal system, and other provinces who, like Isabel Province, and where I originally come from, it is the traditional matrilineal system that I will be basing my talk on, and which is where the research work has been based on. So looking at this and how this impacts the use and management of coastal resources. I think the second point for the research focus, you will see there that given our commitment to regional platforms like the SPC, we have the Framework for Action for Scaling CBRM in the Pacific, and we are looking, trying to consider how this will be implemented in a matrilineal society, or in other cases in a patrilineal context, should some communities be at that or be practicing that as the traditional system. So we look at two research questions. One is, what are the benefits and risks to matrilineal system as defined by islanders who live within those community contexts? And number two is how development and conservation actors should work with matrilineal systems in order for communities to sustainably manage their coastal resources. In terms of the methodology, this is the map of the Solomon Islands, and you will see that's Isabel Province over there. Isabel Province, all around the province, they practice, or it is traditionally matrilineal society. Taking you further down, you will see those yellow points or yellow tags there. These are the 4 sites that we've done our research for this matrilineal survey, looking at how communities are relating to community-based resource management, or CBRM for short, and how the matrilineal system in these different sites are affecting or are impacting how we make decisions within the different areas around Isabel Province. You will see there, notice that there are 2 stars colored in red. These are provincial fisheries offices or fishery centers that we have placed in the provinces. We see that having this research, looking at those different aspects of having communities that are closer to those fishery centers, and other communities who are further from these fishery centers, how this will impact the connection or the networks women or other groups within the communities can access the fisheries services that the government provides from the national level or at the provincial level. So that is the dynamic that we were looking at in identifying these sites. So having 2 sites closer to the fisheries centers and 2 sites that are further. I think you might want to know why I'm highlighting the fisheries centers in the Solomon Islands. The fisheries centers are part of the service that the national government is providing to the provinces to elevate or to support communities with socioeconomic support in the various areas in Solomon Island provinces. So the study samples, I've mentioned a little bit in my previous slide. However, some other points was based on communities that have high involvement in coastal fisheries, yeah, and this is common in a lot of Pacific Island countries, and as well as in the Solomon Islands. As long as you are close to the coast or you're close to the sea, you will have high involvement in fishing activities. And as I mentioned today, the degree of proximity to provincial fisheries centers, which play an important role and will be an important information to provide to the provincial government and the National Fisheries Agency, the Ministry of Fisheries, in understanding how these communities are directly linked or having access to these fisheries centers, and if that plays a role as well in how fisheries is managed or is accessed by the different groups within the communities that I've mentioned today. In terms of key informant interviews and focus group was the main source of collecting information from the different sites. We had a first consultation which involved key informant interviews. To these 4 different sites, there were around 39 key informant interviews done. And for validation, the team went and did focus group discussion at these different sites as well as at the provincial center to get more information from other practitioners living within the provincial centers as well. And most common inheritance practice was for land to be handed down through the female line from mother to daughters. So for Isabel province, it was a different case where matrilineal was the primary traditional system for handing over knowledge, traditional practices of fishing from the female line to the mothers and to the daughters. So this has been a historical way of transferring knowledge and traditional practices within the province and still is today. In terms of benefits to the matrilineal system across the 4 sites, and I've mentioned today the 39 key informants, it was discussed that matrilineal practices as being applied and is delivering benefits to local people. So across the 39 interviews and from validation, 95% think that the matrilineal system is really supporting our approach to CBRM in terms of sustainability of working towards resource management, and it is actually working today. The value of women's involvement in decision making by the tribe as they were land rights holders. It is recognized that women are the land rights holders, and there is value for the involvement of women in the decision making that is taking place in terms of land or sea resource management. Within this matrilineal society, women can be appointed as chief, and there are few communities or few people who have been living in some communities that women have been chief, and this is very different, and this is very, for other provinces as well within the Solomon Islands. And maintain local culture and indigenous knowledge. I mentioned today it is passed down from history from our grandparents to today, where our young people are still practicing these indigenous knowledge and traditional fishing practices, and women caring about and knowing about natural resources, an important contributing factor in natural resource management. So as part of the knowledge transfer, in that the context, or it is combined with how you are to do management. And it is, as a matrilineal society, it is the responsibility of a mother, or a daughter, that you have to know the knowledge of how to manage your resources around you, whether it be on land or in the sea. As in the Solomon Islands, we say that we are the resource owners of the sea that we look after, or the marine fisheries that we look after. Thus, having that is really important in passing it down to our generations. And a sense of cooperative relations, which is differing to in other provinces who practice patrilineal traditional system. Some risks I would like to highlight in the matrilineal system. Evidence of matrilineal system is fading. You will see they're replaced by dominance of men, especially over mining and logging decision making. So even though we have that knowledge passed down in terms of resource management, however, there are other extractive industries coming as well into the communities or nearby to the communities that we work with, and there's evidence that dominance of men in decision making over such, I would say, land activities, can be destructive. It changes the communal support, and actually creates division between families and tribes, with these activities. And respect for traditional undermine as a result of westernized behavior influencing young people. I think that is another risk, where young people are venturing into or exposed to westernized lifestyle as well, and because of having, we say that communication is very important, so we have networks in the villages, I would say, but somehow being connected to the outside world can undermine the traditional way of living in the communities as well. So this is a risk that was highlighted as well through the process of collecting data. And another one there is low literacy level against or amongst women. So this really influences as well my first point on men being dominant in other areas of decision making in terms of mining and logging, or those land-based activities. Ways of working with matrilineal systems for sustainable resource management. That was another part of this research. And it is important, we see that working with the community-based resource management, it is also important for us to look at what are the approaches we as practitioners should take, whether we are from an NGO partner or we are from the government. It is still important that we need to understand what kind of system is in that province or in that community specifically. So from this research, we found that understanding the matrilineal system is very important, rather than trying to impose patriarchal norms. Sometimes external partners, they go into the community and only want to talk with the chiefs, that is normal, or want to talk with just the tribal leaders, in the communities, which we found that from it is not really supporting the communities or having an inclusive decision making in the outcome of whatever intervention we go in with. So sometimes when the project or program we go out, then everything goes back to normal, because information is not transferred to everyone in the community. So it will depend on whoever the leader, the external partner or external practitioner meets with. He will be the only one who has that knowledge sitting with him or in his house, or unless he shares the information. Secondly, increase women's participation in any decisions around land and sea, example around marine resource management. As a matrilineal society, it is important that women or young girls must be involved in any decision making around land or sea management. And empowerment and knowledge sharing on marine and environmental subject across different groups within the community. This somehow relates to my first point today. It is important to ensure that everyone in the community are or should be involved in any meetings, any empowerment or any trainings done in the communities. As I've mentioned today, even though one group or one intervention is focused on a particular subject which only will involve leaders in the community, but in terms of awareness and for information sharing across everyone in the community, it needs the empowerment of every different groups in the communities that we work with. And for Isabel Province, my last point there is on collaboration with women's association, church groups, and CBOs. So in the communities that we work with, there are other CBOs, community-based organizations, and other, like the church groups, to which women are heavily involved in, yeah? And that could be the pathway to ensure that we are engaging other groups in the communities, especially for women or youth groups inside the community. So these are some of the ways of working we found in this research that will be helpful for, especially when you're working with such communities through the matrilineal system in Isabel. I think some brief on the discussion or conclusion. The study was an opportunity to explore the interrelationship between inheritance, social norms, gender, and CBRM practices. The CBRM practice, or community-based resource management practice, has been an overtime learning across Solomon Islands, and I would say across the Pacific as well. And we have come out with a lot of best practices as well within the country itself. However, we see the need that going down further, it is important through this research, understanding the traditional system. And for this case, it would be the matrilineal system. A matrilineal system would be different on how you intervene with the people or how you discuss with the people within a matrilineal system compared to one, I would say, for example, in Malaita province, who are strictly a patrilineal system. So your approaches will differ very much as well in trying to have a successful intervention with the communities that we work with, especially around resource management. Secondly, people clearly see the benefits of the matrilineal system, though there are other destructive activities where women are undermined for their decision, especially I've mentioned today with the mining and logging that is taking place and is at height in the Solomon Islands. There is still the recognition that the matrilineal system is the way forward in ensuring our resources are managed in a sustainable way, and that will be there always to support our future generations in the coming years. And major changes to land use occurring, resulting in corroding of inclusive decision making as well as dominance of men in decision making, and lack of matrilineal system understanding can mislead interventions and affirmation. I think that point, the last point, is very important as well, and I think I've touched a little on that. Sometimes we go in with expectations already as practitioners into the communities. However, not understanding the traditional system within that community or the social norms within that community, it can be misleading as well. And through that, we cannot be successful in our objectives as well when we try to support our communities that we work with. And yeah, thank you too much for that, and looking forward to questions after. Thank you.
Gupla Avinon Olgeta, Raya Toros in my father's language, the Torah. Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, and dignitaries. I'd like to acknowledge Her Excellency Fiame Naomi Mataafa, former Prime Minister of Samoa, is with us in this session, and the Pacifica Indigenous and First Nations people present. It's a pleasure to be presenting this morning alongside Faye, Annie, and Mercy. Thank you to Anouk and Mercy and others organising this conference. I'd also like to acknowledge those in our Pacific family that have been affected by Cyclone Maila, particularly communities in parts of PNG, including Bougainville, and our brothers and sisters in the Solomon Islands. Our thoughts and prayers are with you and your families during this difficult time as you work to rebuild your communities. Belonging to a matrilineal society myself, this Indigenous system has always been a great interest to me. My father is from Rorovana on the central east coast of Bougainville. In the short presentation, I'd like to share some reflections, beginning with defining matrilineal and concluding with some considerations drawing more broadly on Indigenous systems and commonalities shared with First Nations Australians. Matrilineal and patrilineal descent systems are defined as decision-making units with the fundamental difference, structural difference, being the gender through which the lines of authority and group placement run. In patrilineal descent groups, both group membership and authority are determined by males, and in matrilineal descent groups, although the line of authority runs through the males, group membership is determined through the female line. In matrilineal systems, the gender of the individual who marries into the descent group, otherwise known as the in-marrying affine, is the husband. In most matrilineal societies, an individual must marry someone outside their clan, an arrangement described as an exogamous one. I always like to ask the question, why should we care about this? So what? The matrilineal system is just one of many Indigenous systems that is resilient. We as Pacific people, First Nations, and Indigenous people have always known this. These systems have worked. They have ensured our survival. And Papua New Guineans have lived on their lands for approximately 50,000 years. Let that sink in. 50,000 years. Intensive European colonisation only occurred from 1880, only 150 years. But this is not just about longevity. These systems have governed land, resolved conflicts, managed natural resources, and held communities together across generations, without Western courts, without constitutions, without bureaucracies. The matrilineal system in Bougainville did not survive 150 years of colonial disruption, 2 world wars, and a decade-long civil war by accident. It survived because it works. And at a moment when Bougainville is rebuilding its institutions and its future, it is directly relevant. To bring this to life, I want to touch briefly on how matrilineal operates in Bougainville and the role of women in this system. Lineage, land rights, customary knowledge, and stories all pass through the female line. through grandmothers, mothers, aunties, sisters, daughters, nieces. Women are the custodians of the system. And critically, women were also the backbone of peace-making during the Bougainville crisis, engaging at every level, from village mediation to formal negotiations. I recently as last night, had a good yarn with my cousin and his wife, both from different parts of Bougainville along the east coast, about how the system is actually experienced on the ground. I wanted to understand the role of men in matrilineal systems, and having nerded out on matrilineal systems for a long time, this was also humbling for me. These sort of 4 distinct, layered and key responsibilities that they have. As brothers to their sisters, they support and facilitate women's decisions over land, customary processes, feasts. Women lead and men enable. As uncles to their nieces and nephews, they are the guardian and protector of the clan, ensuring the next generation's rights to land are upheld and the clan's continuity secured. As father to their daughters and sons, they provide support and love, and through the father-daughter relationship in particular, inter-clan ties are strengthened, though children carry their clan membership through their mother. And as husband to wife, they provide for the household and support their wife's goals. She is the long-term strategic thinker, and he is her partner in that vision. As my cousin described it, men have responsibilities to 2 clans in matrilineal systems, the one they were born into and the one their wife and children belong to. My cousin and his wife also spoke about how the system varies across Bougainville's regions with more than 20 language groups. For example, in Tiop communities on the northeast coast of Bougainville, the system is practiced with great rigour and accountability. Breaches of customary obligations carry real consequences, compensation through feasts, pigs and shell money, and apologies if wrong has been done. Closer to urban centres like Arawa and Kieta, from the 1960s onwards, they have experienced greater exposure to Western norms, and some of this has impacted some of the processes within the matrilineal system. I always find I'm very grateful to belong and to bring in my family, because that is what drives all of my work. So just wanted to provide a small snippet of my story and show the adaptable and fluid nature of the system. In 1969, my mother, Mary Kath Togolo, nee Regan, an Australian of Irish heritage, moved to PNG to teach in Rabaul. In the late 70s, she and my father married in his village, Rorovana. The matrilineal system meant my mother had to belong to a clan. She was adopted into the Saubele clan, the preferred paired clan to my father's Puini clan. She learnt Tokpisin and understood Torau, my Tokples. By the time we left in 1989, due to the Civil War, she had lived in Bougainville for a decade and PNG for 2 decades. She contributed fully to births, customary events, looking after nieces, nephews, aunties, grandmothers, When she became terminally ill in 2006, my father's mother, Tete Bakwai, said that her ashes must be buried Loples in the village, in her Sawele clan cemetery. All the protocols were followed. To date, she is the only white woman buried in the village, and I think this demonstrates, or is one example of the dynamic nature of the matrilineal system, its capacity to embrace change and to allow my sisters and I to belong to a clan, to a village, and to Bougainville. So this, instead of rings, traditional marriages, you would exchange pisu between the husband and wife, and these are just some of, as you can see, I'm glowing in the pictures. And with some of my aunties. Scholars have long identified what anthropologist Audrey Richard in 1950 called the matrilineal puzzle, the inherent tension in a system built on both female descent and male authority. The system generates direct competition between in-marrying husbands and maternal brothers over where the family lives and who holds authority over the children. Kathleen Goff, writing in 1961, argued that matrilineal is particularly vulnerable to contact with Western industrial economies, that under modernisation, matrilineal descent groups gradually disintegrate. Mary Douglas in 1969 asked directly, is matrilineal doomed? Framing it as fragile in the face of economic change. But resilience does not mean unchanged. The crisis was not only a political military event, it was, there was cultural rupture in some ways. Family I spoke with suggested that children who grew up during that period lived through trauma. The matrilineal system was tested. The system depends on the transmission of knowledge, peace building, conflict resolution, feasts, shell money exchanges, inter-clan alliances maintained through women's custodianship. Some of these aspects may have been impacted, but the system remains intact. Other changes, dispersion of clan members, women moving to their husband's land instead of the other way around, knowledge and ceremony not being passed on may also have an impact. My family also shared that some young men are increasingly oriented towards self-interest and struggle with some of the responsibilities that the system asks of them, referring to some of the roles that men play, and are still making sense of their role in the aftermath of the crisis. Their sense of the prognosis was nuanced. The system will survive, they felt, but it will adapt. The question, as one of them put it, is not whether the system survives, but in what form, and that depends on choices this generation is making now. The story of my mother is one expression of something I see across Indigenous and First Nation communities more broadly, the extraordinary, often invisible, load-bearing strength of Indigenous women. My partner and I are co-founders and directors of an Indigenous-owned business. Our business partner is a proud Gamilaroi man. We are both from PNG. Over the past 8 years, we have observed First Nations female entrepreneurs carrying their families, their communities, their cultural obligations, and their businesses simultaneously. It is how they understand their role. To me, it mirrors what the matrilineal system describes. The woman as a long-term strategic thinker, thinking years ahead, caring for the household and community, maintaining culture and relationship, as well as employing other First Nations people, with men supporting those functions. The matrilineal system has outlasted colonial administration, 2 world wars and a civil war in Bougainville. It survives because it holds people together and gives everyone a role that is valued. Thank you very much for having me here.
Aswalia, good afternoon. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gathered today. I pay my respect to the rarely acknowledged connections my ancestors have to Aboriginal lands through the history of blackbirding and indentured labor in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm a Malayan woman from the Solomon Islands, and our historical relations with Australia, as well as with colonized Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia, among the ones that we know from history, have profoundly shaped gender relations in our past as well as today. I'd also like to acknowledge the dignitaries that we have in the room today. It is an honor to be in your presence. I'm also conscious of the ongoing debates around culture and gender inequality in leadership, or rather inequalities in leadership from the community level up to the national level. These include discussions on gender-based violence and custom, gender identities, sexuality, domesticity, and universal human rights. Those of us who work in gender and development as practitioners, as well as academics, know these debates very well, and they matter. Because at the core of these debates is the shared goal to make the world a safer and more just place for women and children, and to challenge toxic masculinities, as well as to ensure women have a voice in decision-making at all levels, and to contain gender-based violence so that survivors can access justice. So in the next 4 slides, I want to elaborate on just one point: the importance of historical awareness and sensitivity in conversations on gender. And I'm not doing that because I'm biased as a historian, maybe just a little, but I think that it's a very, very important thing that we ought to be reminded of in our work. Gender inequalities, gender-based violence, hypermasculinity, and entrenched patriarchy that we see today in Solomon Islands, as well as other Pacific Island nations, are deeply rooted in colonial and Christian legacies of our recent past. Yes, traditional culture is not static, but we need to acknowledge that along the way, our cultural systems are shaped by external influences beyond our control and also indigenized by ourselves. What we often regard as culture today may be shaped by Christian and colonial legacies, or in fact shaped by those factors and reinforced over time. And so this is why historical awareness is crucial. Without historical awareness, we risk missing opportunities to address gender inequality, violence, and patriarchy in more creative and meaningful as well as ethical ways. I respect the work of IOM, but this is an example of a blanket statement that could have been presented differently if there were greater historical awareness of the profound and compounded inequalities that underpin the formation of the post-colonial state of Solomon Islands, the religious lifestyle of present-day Solomon Islands, and the reinforcement of patriarchal institutions today. I'll let you read that for yourself. We ought to be reminded that Solomon Islands and other Pacific Island nations, and Solomon Islands in particular, has been an independent nation for only 47 years, 9 months, and 6 days today. Prior to that, we were subjected to British colonial rule, during which men were ushered into paid employment, preferred as church pastors, ministers, and leaders, and handpicked by colonial administrations to lead communities, their own communities, served as chiefs, and act as intermediaries for the government, the colonial government. And I'd like to, throw in a little bit of personal experience there as well, because I think it brings the importance of historical awareness to the fore. Throughout my primary school years, during school assemblies, if you have children, I'd like you to imagine that as well. We would stand in lines by class. The headmaster or workmaster would stand in front of the entire school and shout, "Hands on your shoulders, stand at ease, attention." That was during my childhood, all the way in all my primary school years. We were instructed to remain quiet and to spread our fingers so prefects could inspect them. And if your fingers are dirty, you would be punished. And punishment includes whipping or hard labor. We ought to remember that violence, for instance, was instituted in our lives and enforced upon us not very long ago. I am reminded here of the scholarship of the remarkable Tracy Banivan-Nuamar on colonial violence. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I promise Anouk and Mercy that I will be short and brief, and so I'll see if I can get through this quickly. We often wonder why women's representation in parliament and leadership positions in Solomon Islands is among the lowest in the world. Yet we forget that it was only 47 years ago, 9 months and 6 days, that the colonial administration in Solomon Islands reached the pinnacle of its masculinizing project of governance and leadership. By the time we were transitioning into independence, male political leadership was normalized. Corporal punishment was normalized. The confinement of women to spaces such as the kitchen was normalized. The late anthropologist Roger Kissing and historian Peter Corris were right to point out that not once did the British authorities concede that Solomon Islanders had ever had sovereign rights to their islands or any rights at all. Traditional governance structures were ignored because Solomon Islanders were seen as incapable of having functional systems of governance. The photos on this slide that you can see were taken by Australian photographer John Watt Beatty in 1906. They're among some of the wonderful images in Solomon Islands history. And that's taken elsewhere on Isabel. Faye and I went to school together, on a side note. But they depict a meeting that was formed, a meeting that's known as the Vaukolo movement, or native parliament, that began in 1887 on the island of Gela, and it was initiated by Anglican missionary Alfred Penny and later implemented by another missionary, John Plant, in the Floridas on Gela. Sorry, I don't have a map for you there. But if you look at these images, you can see that there are no women present in these images at all. At the second meeting of the Vaukolo in 1888, its leaders passed laws to fine individuals found guilty of violating the 7th commandment of the Bible. I don't know if any of you know that, the 7th commandment at the top of your head, but it is, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." And there are other fines for other laws as well, including those whose pigs were roaming around the village or trespass into other people's properties. Other issues discussed at the meeting include islanders' frustration over the mass recruitment of young men from villages to work at the plantation in Queensland, in Samoa, as well as in Fiji, because these recruiters did not get the consent of the parents of the young men that they're recruiting. And later on in the life of the movement, there is also a call for an increase in plantation wages. And it is important to point out that all of these are men's concerns, because at that time, the colonial administration of the Solomon Islands, paid labor is only a men thing. David Hilliard wrote in his 1978 book, God's Gentleman, that the missionaries guided the Vaukolo, to to introduce laws on adultery and marriage, trespass by pigs, and the recognition of the powers of the church teachers. Most of these church teachers are Anglican trained. Leadership that fell straight to men. Women are not in this picture, even at this point. By the 1970s and the 1980s, men became well-versed in and empowered by the new authority bestowed upon them through their experiences within a patriarchal colonial system and Christian establishment. They were educated, able to teach, write, and were positioned to interpret the traditional practices without the need to recruit or include women. I have used that, shown this slide many times, but it remains a clear example of how men were empowered to imagine their existence within a colonial governance structure that normalized the absence of women in leadership and exclude their voices in decision-making. And these are sets of custom codes from Kwarai and Koyo. I am from Kwarai. The ones on this side are from Kwarai, and the other ones are from Koyo, collected by anthropologist David Aiken. These codes do not explain in any way the context of these restrictions on women, or how these codes could also be applied to men. Now, I'll let you take that in for a moment. To return to the point I made earlier, historical awareness is crucial in conversations on gender and development in Solomon Islands. In a way, I feel like we should all be historians by default. And I couldn't stress this enough, because there are so many reports that I read coming out of the development space, coming out of academia, that lack any historical awareness or consciousness of how the very structures in which we function in today have so much to do with our Christian legacies, with our colonial legacies. And these are not very long ago experiences. They happened 47 years ago in the case of the Solomons. I will leave you with these photos, which I took at 14 years old on New Year's Day in 2000. Because at the heart of any community are people going about their daily lives, hosting feasts and gatherings, working together irrespective of gender. I'll stop there. Thank you too much for listening.
Right, good morning through Olgeta. Thank you to Maslo Yuplastaplohia Wulo Namandran. My name is Mercy. I'd like to, like with my fellow panelists, pay respect and acknowledge the first Australians, the Indigenous people of this land, and also, sorry, something's happening. There you go. And also to acknowledge Her Excellency Fiame Naomi Mataafa. Thank you for being here. In my remarks, I will be sharing insights from some of the work that I've been doing with the Pacifica Communities University in Fiji. And this work is alongside collaborations with gender scholars across the Pacific, also scholars here in Australia and in New Zealand, and my own research on masculinity in the Pacific and how we engage men and boys in dealing with violence. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll be quick. Pacifica communities, as we've heard today in the opening remarks, are navigating a complex web of development challenges, rising gender-based violence, deepening educational and economic disparities, exclusion of women from decision-making spaces, and increasing vulnerability to climate justice. Despite decades of development interventions, a critical question remains: why have mainstream gender approaches failed to transform the lived experiences or realities of Pacifica people. Through my work, I've been part of an emerging regional effort responding to this question, and that's restoring gender, a Pacifica whole of life perspective. When I speak with colleagues and others within the space about this work, there's a real sense of urgency as well as excitement. And these are not abstract conversations. They are shaping the next generation of Pacific thinkers, advocates, and policymakers. So today I'll be reflecting on masculinity in the Pacific, not as a fixed and inherently problematic conversation, but also as something that's dynamic, shaped by culture, history, and ongoing change. So when we hear gender, we often think about women, and rightfully so. But focusing only on women gives us an incomplete picture. Masculinity, how we define and perform being a man, shapes relationships, power, and decision-making. In the Pacific, expectations of manhood are deeply rooted in culture, but they are also evolving rapidly under pressures like migration, economic change, and globalization. If we exclude men from gender conversations, we risk reinforcing the very inequalities we're trying to address. So gender justice requires us to understand masculinity, how it is formed, maintained, and transformed. Globally, masculinity studies are expanding, but here for us in the Pacific, there is still a lot of gap. Men are often portrayed in narrow ways as perpetrators. They're also portrayed as protectors and also authority figures. But this is only part of the story. Men are also experiencing emotional suppression, economic pressure, and identity conflict. Many want to engage differently, but lack the safe spaces to reflect and grow. This is why we need a holistic, context-specific approach to masculinity, one that looks at upbringing, our culture, spirituality, and social change. In response to these gaps, a regional initiative has emerged. Restoring Gender, Pacifica Whole of Life Perspective is led by the Pacifica Communities University under the leadership of Upolulu Mava'ai, Reverend Professor. And this initiative challenges external imposed gender frameworks and instead centers on indigenous ethics, cultural knowledge, and theological reflection. At the heart of it is the new Pacifica Gender Program, new as in coconut, symbolizing resilience, rootedness, and regeneration. And this paradigm reflects a whole of life approach, recognizing that gender is interconnected with spirituality, with community, environment, and identity. This paradigm was shaped through a collective dialogue. So we've had two regional think tanks meetings in Fiji, so in 2024 and 2025, which brought together academics, policymakers, and practitioners through a reflective relational dialogue, Talanoa, as most of us know. Participants were able to critically examine dominant gender frameworks. A key insight emerged from the conversation. Many rights-based, policy-driven approaches, while valuable, do not fully resonate with Pacific communities, especially in grassroots, cultural, and faith-based contexts. And this highlights the urgent need for a paradigm shift led by Pacifica voices. Pacifica thinkers argue that gender must be understood through faith, cultural narratives, ethics of care and restraint, communal responsibility. Rather than importing solutions, we must reimagine gender within or from within. And this is not about rejecting global frameworks, but about grounding them in our local realities. Colonialism didn't just shape economies, it also reshaped gender. Western frameworks redefined masculinity and femininity, suppressed indigenous gender diversity, and imposed rigid roles. Men were framed as violent and uncivilized, and women as victims or dependents. And these narratives still influence policies today. They influence institutions and self-perception of today in the Pacific. So to move forward, we must decolonize how we understand gender. It's important to challenge simplified views of patriarchy and also a matriarchy. In many Pacific societies, systems were patriarchal in structure, but women held significant authority, and many of the speakers here also spoke about that. Women managed land and lineage, they led rituals, they mediated disputes, they preserved knowledge, and their leadership was often relational and community-based, not always formal and political. Gender equality is not a Western concept for us in the Pacific. Many Pacific traditions already reflected shared leadership, complementary roles, mutual respect, and these systems still exist today in adapted forms. So by reclaiming these narratives, we can build gender justice that feels authentic, culturally grounded, and sustainable. Published research in the region demonstrates that many Pacific men are navigating tensions between tradition and modernity, cultural expectations and economic realities, and their role as providers remains central, but it is increasingly difficult. This creates stress, shame, and sometimes silence. But alongside this, there is transformation. There's amazing work that's done by local organizations throughout the Pacific that are working with men in supporting that transformation. So historical and cultural evidence shows that men are caregivers. And I always refer to this particular photo Annie you showed one time at our Pacific Research Colloquium of there were men sitting on a log. And I think this photo was taken back in the 1930s. Yeah. And they were carrying children with them while that person was taking photos. So you could see that men were already practicing caregiving roles. Men were also supporting or continue to support families in diverse ways. And these are not new, they are reclaimed identities. Men are not just part of the problem, they are part of the solution. And so creating spaces for men to reflect, share their experiences, challenge norms is essential. And when men are included meaningfully, they become allies, advocates, and change makers. Critical masculinity studies helped us to understand how masculinity is shaped by systems like colonialism, religion, how norms can be questioned and redefined. And in the Pacific, masculinities have been influenced by colonial history, Christianity, economic pressures. And these forces created rigid expectations, but they can be reshaped. These approaches see men not as obstacles, but as partners in gender justice. So to move forward, we must rethink engagement strategies. Instead of excluding men, we invite them in, use culturally relevant language, draw on local values. Key platforms include education, church, sports, community gatherings, and using concepts like vanua, or community, or land, lotu, faith, talk story, talanoa, story and yarning, dialogue. We can reshape masculinity in meaningful ways. So this work is not about legacy, the work that we're doing in the region, looking at working with men and boys. What stories we will shape the next generation is important. We must normalize shared leadership. We must normalize care as strength and emotional openness. Masculinity should not be defined by dominance, control, and silence, but by responsibility, relationality, and community care. So this is not just a critique of failed approaches. It is a hopeful, constructive pathway. The new Pacifica gender paradigm offers a culturally grounded way of looking at our communities. It's spiritually rooted, and it's community-led. And it calls for transformation that reflects the interconnectedness of all our lives in the Pacific. So thank you very much. Ulo.
A big thank you to all our presenters this morning to share such a rich experience and perspectives. Mercy and I prepared a couple of reflection questions, and then we'll throw to the audience. We'll go a little bit over time, but I'm sure you'll agree that the richness of this discussion will be worth it. Mercy, did you want to kick off with a question to the group? And yourself, yeah? Where? Mercy's doubling up.
Oh, gosh. Thank you, Anouk. Okay, I'll susa. So my last slide, I didn't have a slide, but my last talking points were around narratives. So, thinking about the younger generation, young people today in the Pacific, what do you think are some ways in which we can retell or reimagine talking about women's agency and the way they're influencing communities, churches, workplaces, or if this work is already happening? I think it's so important for us to, inform the younger generation of the places where women are celebrated. And I feel like that's sort of a narrative that needs to, come out more. So the question is, in what ways have you seen that happen, or maybe ways that you think we can do better at telling that sort of complementarity kind of role and women's agency? Yeah.
I am reminded of the keynote this morning. Your Excellency said something about curriculum matters deeply. That's, I quote. And I wrote that down because in the case of the Solomons, and I can only speak for the Solomons, I strongly believe, the school, let me put it this way, the reason that I ended up in history, to pursue history as for my studies, I didn't, I went to uni with Faye doing environmental studies as an undergrad. But we don't even have history in schools, in our schools. And so changing the narrative needs to be, it needs retelling the stories that we are so familiar with in the present, and that is history at the core of it. And so having these topics, these decolonial topics, deconstructing the structures that we inherit in the present, starting at the lowest level in the schools and coming up, I think is an effective way. And I have not seen that being much of a, something that happened in the case of the Solomons. Also investing in institutions like the National Museum in the Solomons, for instance, that tells this kind of stories, to be able to shift the narrative that we are so accustomed to in the present, that tell us that women have no place in leadership, that women have no place in women's places in the kitchen. All of these narratives, we know as Solomon Islanders and as Pacific Islanders, that's not true. We know that from our own upbringing, but we need to engage with this conversation efficiently and constructively in the public space as much as in our communities. And so, looking for creative ways to tell the stories, I think, to shift the narrative.
Thank you for your question. I guess with the experience I've been having across working with many communities with community-based resource management, I guess it's for each and everyone to have the sense of identity and not to go too much astray. Yeah? I've explained today in my presentation today, there are interventions from, especially for young youths, there are influences of westernization, and that takes us a bit out of our scope on who we are as a Solomon Islander, or for who we are as someone coming from a small community. I guess having that embedded in you and you not losing your culture, I would say. Though I'm working with at the national level within the Ministry of Fisheries, but every time I try to, or I always reflect back to who I am as a woman from Isabel Province. What is my culture? I cannot go astray from my culture or how I am brought up within my family, yeah. So I guess having that identity everywhere you go, from where you started at school and where you have reached at the moment, because without your culture and without your expectations or your norms within your families, you wouldn't be who you are. Yeah, like for me, who I am today, yeah. I guess that would be the way I would try to, yeah. Thank you.
In the conversation I was having last night with my cousin and his wife, they spoke about this younger generation, the role of young men. And for Bougainville specifically, there is that a lot of trauma that has been experienced and passed down to the next generation and the next, and people are having children younger, so we're seeing, I used to think I was young, but it's the young generation now, who have, I think, different challenges with some of the aspects that Mercy raised, expectations on them and the tension between understanding their role in their community and their responsibilities and whether they feel equipped. And I think, they also have, technology, and that is something for them to navigate. And I think I don't envy that generation, because if you don't understand your culture and sort of seek to see where you fit in and what your role is, you may not, these young people may not be having those conversations, for example, in the village, because they're on their phones. Or they're not going to school, or they don't have a job, so they're doing other things. And I think if I don't know what the solution is, but I think it will be at that community level, in their village, that they feel like they belong and they are valued and they're needed. Because that's where I feel that those conversations can occur. For example, if they haven't had access to education for whatever reason, or they don't go to church because they might have had a big night. How do you access that cohort and make them feel like they belong to something?
Yeah, thank you. In the interest of time, we might go to some questions from the audience, and I'll ask for some people at the back there just to help with roaming microphones. So any questions from the audience to the panel about some of the issues we've discussed today? Yes, Margaret, if someone could get a mic to Margaret, thank you. Yep, and then
Thanks so much to all the panellists. And I just wanted to start with that image, Mercy, that you raised from Anouk's research in Solomon's about the men, really, obviously caring for infants and young children. And I just wanted to kind of remind us that in Annie's work, that's then framed by how that photograph by Beattie, as I recall, in 1906 or something, was then used by foreign observers to completely cut out the infants and to show those Solomon's men as only martial warriors. So I think there's something really important in the kind of history of these external relationships. And, I think, just putting your paper, Annie, together with Faye's about, how stereotypically not just this monolithic presentation of Solomon Island culture as patriarchal, but the way in which there are these divisions created between Isabel and Malaita, in terms of one being strongly matrilineal. And I suppose the question that I wanted to ask was, we can see all of these external influences in the present, like logging and mining, which is clearly, tending to kind of take away some of the power of that matrilineal system. But I also, Mercy, just in relationship to the whole of life perspective, I suppose from the work that I've done and certainly being involved with Annie's work recently, I mean, the Christian churches have to also be seen as quite complicit in the construction of these ideas of, feminised spaces, the home, the kitchen, and masculinised spaces in what, we might see as public political life. And so how far do you think that Christian theology is able to critically reflect on that history and to actually, if they're seeking another language than universal human rights, how far to kind of reformulate that in a way that, really, that not only talks of complementarity but justice between men and women? Thank you.
I mean, I can respond. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the approach in which looking at reframing or restoring really goes back to what Annie has been talking about and what she's been advocating on, which is the historical forces that have influenced the gender spaces, the way we think about gender. So we have to, with what you're saying, with theology, with culture, with history, with globalization, put all these forces out there and really re-examine how that has influenced gender, and how, as a community, I guess, it is a community-based approach. As a community, what do we agree as what's good for us? There are certain parts of every influence that's good, whether it's faith, whether it's culture. So it's really re-examining that together as a community and finding the values in what's important for us to take forward. That's what I can say. But, it's an evolving conversation, but a really good question. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question. Okay, thank you. So my name's Anna Nauper, and I'm an office buddy of Annie. So I want to ask this question, but I guess I have two parts to my question. The first is, I think, just building off what Margaret asked, and thank you, Mercy, and thank you all for your really informative contributions. I think we're seeing, if we pick up the Christian thread, we're seeing Christian churches be much more progressive around the world in relation to women. I mean, the Anglican Church is now headed by a female, for example. Yet within the Pacific, it's slower. And I think there's something there for us to be thinking about in terms of, yes, the churches have been part of the problem. They can also be part of the solution, but they're not yet there in the Pacific, whilst they are further along elsewhere. So what does that then mean for how we think about restoring on gender? The second part, I come from a patrilineal system in southern Vanuatu. And I love learning about matrilineal systems. I live next to a village outside of Port Vila that is dual. It's patrilineal and matrilineal, and they move between the both. And I guess what I want to ask is, there is a trap that we can fall into, and this is the cliche caution that Nayamui talked about this morning, which is that we focus on matrilineal systems as a big part of the solution, and absolutely there is so much to learn from them. But in doing so, what can we do in relation to patrilineal systems and the role that women and men play together? And I want to prompt that thinking, because I know in my own system on Erromango in southern Vanuatu, women are part of the decision making, even though it's a patrilineal system and the way it works, but it's hidden or it's buried. And so what are your suggestions around how we can work within our patrilineal systems too? And particularly also educate those of those UN agencies and outside as well, to just recognize that the patrilineal system also has really good strengths for women as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's two questions there, one on the church and then the second on patrilineal systems. Anna, did you want to go? Who wants to jump in?
Yeah, I think these questions are really important, like the so what and inverting and looking at, the roles of women in patrilineal societies and how scholars have also spoken, written about it, and I think for a long time the literature has been, we've been written about, and I think that it is our responsibility as within those groups to, if you're part of a woman in a patrilineal society, having a Indigenous women speak to that too, and to see, I guess, more of like personally, I haven't read anything by any Indigenous women about that that position, and I would like to see. I would like to see more of that, because you see in, I guess, the matrilineal literature more, and Bougainville always leans, this uniqueness about it, because the dominant sort of view has been of, their roles in decision making aren't as prominent as in matrilineal systems. So I don't really have an answer, but I'm very interested in it too, because I think in there somewhere is the opportunity to reach, to work towards gender justice. I've seen in some of the field work I do as part of my role, when I go out to communities and we do, focus group discussions and key informant interviews, and, seeing men speak for the women, and you don't get to have that insight because you're only there for a short period of time, but to understand what role women have played in key decisions about their land and their life and their communities.
Thank you. Yeah. I guess I'm gonna answer this way. With your question around church and the expansion of having women being priests or bishops, I would say, in other countries, but not in the Pacific. I guess it comes back to our expectations as who we are as a female, I would say. And this would be from experience in the communities that I have been working with. And I am an Anglican myself. And yeah, when you talk about bishop or priest, it would be as expected, and I guess that is gender. And the interesting thing about gender, that it is expected that to become a bishop or a priest, for us in the Solomon Island, it would look different, or it would look not normal for a woman. I mean, that is how we see it as I would say where I come from, and from my perspective myself. Yeah, but it doesn't say that you cannot be a priest, but as a female. But where I come from, it would look different if you are a female and becoming an Anglican priest, or something like that. For your second question, I'm not an expert again. I would say that I guess it comes back to our expectations again. And in a matrilineal society would be different, from a patrilineal society, as Annie comes from a patrilineal society. Coming from how we work with the communities in terms of resource management, our approach I think it is most important in the approach we take when we go into these different societies, yeah, or these traditional systems. How we work with the people, like for how I would work in a community that is a patrilineal context, having that context, my approach would be different on how I would approach a community that is around matrilineal or having that matrilineal context. I've worked with gender. I sometimes argue with our scientists or the consultants that come to support us working with gender. In looking at gender as something that for us as practitioners, it is more of us trying to understand who we are working with, yeah? Instead of coming with a force or an intervention that tries to change what is already there in our communities. We cannot change our culture. We cannot change our traditional systems. However, for us within the gender space, and this is my personal view from my experiences, is more on understanding who we are working with, yeah? And understanding how we are to work around what is already existing in those communities that we work with, in terms of resource management, in terms of decision making, in terms of other social aspects that try to look at gender as a way to leverage our different groups in the communities. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Sorry, I just like to throw in a few thoughts in there. So on the Methodist Church in the Solomons is quite progressive in terms of women ministers. Recently spoke to and had a sit down with Reverend Marita Tahu, who was the first Methodist minister in the Solomons. And she told me that there are many women ministers now coming up in the church. So we are seeing a progress in some denominations, not all. And I think there is a bit of a delayed reaction in the case of the Pacific, sometimes in catching up with these changes that are happening abroad. Again, in the case of the Solomons, 47 years. So that's on that. So I think we will follow the momentum globally. On the anthropological terms, matrilineal and patrilineal, I have consciously decided to avoid those terms in my own work and in my own writing, being aware that they're not very reflective of the realities on the ground. And I am from a place and a culture and a community that would be regarded as pretty much predominantly patrilineal, but it is not. Life is more of a web of interconnectedness. So I trace my ancestry, trace my descendants through both my father and my mother's side of the family, and I belong to all of these spaces. So because of that, I have decided and made the conscious choice that I'm not going to use those terms, and I think that I'm going to advocate for that. And if we are to try to seek to change the narrative, we have to start with those little things, deciding to make a conscious decision to do it our way, to look for the terms in our own cultural context, in our own languages, that can articulate who we are as people. And so I'm of that position.
Okay, sure. Just because everyone spoke. So. Yeah, and I think just reflecting on your point, Anna Naupa, on patriarchal societies, I think we try to look at hierarchy from a relational kind of perspective to understand how men and women complement each other's roles. So there will be times where, and this is the kind of new, I guess, emergent way of thinking about gender and what's sort of relevant to our culture and our context and the historical processes. And so when we think about patriarchy, the challenge is for us here is to think about it in relational terms. I spoke to, and Tony, a colleague with the Women Leading and Influencing, a really great program looking at supporting women leaders in the Pacific. And I asked this question to, I think, like 22 women in the room, and I said, name in your own, or not just name, but describe your the places and spaces in which women have been promoted. You know about this from, listening to your mothers and aunts tell you about women's places, and from across the region, everyone gave a particular a description or a name. So the Fahu, like for us in Manos, up in the highway, we are kind of, we're referred to as the Ndrop. So Manos, very patriarchal, but women have place. Before any, big community or tribe decision is to be made, a woman is a Ndrop, is a basket. What we saw Nahamui demonstrate today. So women have to be present, and they have to speak, and their brothers need to listen to them. They carry with them blessings and curses. Those are the beliefs that we have. So women have their place, but I think for us as Pacifica people is identifying that and using that to our advantage, retelling and that narrative, so the younger generation know that women have place in society, because they're growing up with all this different influence, and the way they're seeing women are treated in our region as having no class, no status, is, I think, an incomplete picture. We need to retell those stories, and we already have them in our cultural practices. Yeah.
Finally, I was amiss in mentioning in the introduction this morning that there are a range of fantastic publications from all of our speakers this morning. In particular, there'll be an article coming up in Society and Natural Resources profiling Faye's work on matrilineal systems and community-based resource management. Anita has several chapters and works about her PhD studies and since. And there's, I think, a chapter in Gender Reimagined featuring Annie's work on history and gender, and also we have some new in-briefs from Mercy Masta. In the interest of time, we may have to wrap up this fascinating discussion. Please thank all of our authors, and do access those resources for more information. Thank you.